Hey, everybody. Welcome into an all-new episode of Can We Please Talk podcast. As always, I'm Mike Leon.
And so much happier when Ohio State loses that game against Michigan. I'm Nick Saveri.
I don't know. We're going to lose our whole Michigan fan base here, Nick. We're going to get into that in just a second. On the program today, speaking of some good news, as Nick just pointed out there, some good news finally happened in the war between Israel and Hamas. Nick and I with the latest on the ceasefire, call it a pause, whatever you want. Hostages have been released. Palestinian prisoners have been released as well. We're going to break it all down. Plus, if you did not hear the crazy story of Emily Hand, remember this name, everybody, the 9-year-old hostage that was part of this release that's happened over the last couple of days between Israel and Hamas. Wait till you hear what happened in this incredible story. More on that in just a bit. Plus, later on in the program, she's a professor over at the University of Notre Dame. She's a historian as well and author of the new book, Democracy in Darkness. Katlyn Carter joins us on the podcast to discuss her new book and how American democracy was actually born under the cloak of darkness, Nick. We're going to get into all of that later on with Katlyn. A really cool book and a really interesting look at democracy and how it all started and how it all came to be. So Katlyn, in just a bit, before I say hello to Mr. Saveri, all new episode of Back Your Play with Q is out there. Q's back from the holiday break, breaking down everything that happened this past weekend in the NFL and college football. Crazy games, championship Saturday upcoming across all the major conferences. A wild finish with Alabama and Auburn. Rich breaks it all down. New episodes of Back Your Play with Q over on LeonMediaNetwork.com or listen wherever you get your podcasts. Now I say hello to my co-host, Mr. Saveri. Nick, how are you doing, man? How's Thanksgiving? We're back from the break here. You're about to go on a little vacation. You're just telling me off air. You can bring it over here, of course, and make everybody jealous. And we're going to be missing you, but we're going to have some fill-in guest hosts that are going to be coming along the way. Well, there's a couple people out there that are not going to miss you, Nick, and your voice. And you get the comments all the time, and I can't wait for you to rebut them here in 2 seconds. Here we go. Here he goes. Here he goes, everybody. Come on, let me hear it, Dr. Saveri. Tell these people how they're going to miss your voice.
I just don't care. Truly, I mean, the fact that they know this means that they listen, which is good, right? Like engagement's always appreciated, but honestly, do better, dude. Seriously, get a mic.
By the way, you texted me a photo of somebody saying that we got too many ads on our show. Folks, listen.
Yeah, you want to take people under the tent a little bit because I appreciate the way you explained it to me. Our boy Mitch is a listener of the show, and shout out to Mitch out in Colorado with his wife Elizabeth, who's also a fan of the program and appeared on the Educate US podcast, which is still available to download or listen to via LeonMediaNetwork.com. But yeah, Mitch hit me up and said, what's up with all the ads? No, he didn't say it like that. He just noted that there was like a lot of ads on the show. And, obviously I was playfully saying, hey, listen, that's like kind of how the bills get paid or a little bit. But you took me a little bit more through, there's other pieces to consider there.
Yeah, listen, first, we'll get into your Thanksgiving break in just a sec. And everybody, I hope you had a happy and healthy Thanksgiving. Folks, when we started this show, Nick and I, 3 years ago, I remember a friend of mine telling me, oh man, wait till you guys get advertisers. It's going to be funny to hear you guys do ad reads. And at the time, I was like, it's never going to happen because I don't, yes, I know how to do an ad read, but I don't know how we're going to do that. Who's going to actually pay us to actually read ads? That means we will have to have accumulated listeners. That means advertisers will have heard that and seen that, and therefore they advertise on the show. So now we're at a point where, again, shout out to Acast, our hosting platform. I always mention them at the end of the show. They insert ads based on your listenership. Thousands of people listen to us, so they insert ads. That's why you get different ad breaks. Nick and I, individually with our show, do sponsorships like we have with BetterHelp. And by the way, you can go to betterhelp.com /Can We Please Talk. And no seriousness, but like that's how we do our ad reads. So apologies for the ads, folks. We will consider it, obviously, but Nick and I, we want to continue to produce great content. We're not beholden to BetterHelp. We can cover issues that are not outside of the mental health space. So that's the way a little appealing of the curtain here of how things work. I apologize, and which is why I try to make the ad reads a little bit more funnier, especially for our sponsors over at Fresh Roasted Coffee and everywhere. Anyway, that's beyond that. I just thought it was funny. give me a little bit of how Thanksgiving break was, and you always like to do this on the education show. By the way, you teased that. You always talk about this humanity part. So, how was Thanksgiving? Let's start there. How was everything in the Zaveri household?
Like any good CEO of a media company, I appreciate you checking all your products, right?
That's right.
So, no, it's true though. Yeah, Educate US. We like to just begin by connecting with one another. It's a practice that we ask anyone to do, in their respective organizations, classrooms, and such. No, it was good. It was an interesting Thanksgiving. My wife was working. Obviously she was at the hospital that day. She usually doesn't miss Thanksgiving, but this year, it just came up. But yeah, so we brought the kids to my parents' house. They had a great time. My sister loves to cook Thanksgiving dinner, so she did that. Friday, the Fantastic Four did come back together, so we had dinner with my wife, and then Sunday actually we did something with some of her work people. So it was another Thanksgiving dinner, and got a chance to catch the Philadelphia Buffalo game. It's a lot of Eagles fans around here, so it was fun to catch. So that was really it. It was, yeah, it's I think for many of us that do a little bit of traveling during this holiday, it's busy. You're on the road. If you got kids with you, you're just hoping to get to wherever you need to in a timely fashion. And for the most part, we did. I don't know anyone of our fans here that listen or out on the West Coast. We saw the just horrible pictures of people stuck on traffic. That was Tuesday before Thanksgiving, and I was already assuming the worst, being off a major highway here in Pennsylvania. Fortunately, it was not that bad. The girls were occupied, so we had a great time. And as I mentioned before, if you're a football fan, this weekend was fantastic. More Saturday than Sunday, but
Yep.
I'll tease this out. Maybe if anyone wants to ask me more about this, but dude, Saturdays are getting a lot more fun than Sundays. I'm just gonna, as a football fan, I'm just gonna leave it there. But it was good though. How about you? How's your holiday?
Good, man. I mean, like you said, Saturday was a lot of fun, and college football has been fun this year to watch. Thanksgiving's always the same old, same old. You're hanging out with family, and I got my sister coming in from out of town, so that was good to see her. She came in from Texas. Girls love seeing her, so a lot of fun, and really good food too. That was the other thing. We'd like to make a panini, which is like a roast pork type of dish, and then you got the turkey and stuff like that. So a lot of good stuff over there at the
Yeah, I mean, not to
yes,
cut you off, like I just did, obviously. Yeah,
obviously.
tell me about that because obviously you are part Cuban, part Afro-Cuban, part, Puerto Rican.
Yeah,
What's the spread look like? You just teased out something that is not the traditional turkey, and I say traditional because I mean it's what most people in America seem to eat,
right.
and it's not always the most exciting thing. I tend to love it, but what's going on in the Leon household?
It,
What's on the plate for Thanksgiving?
well, I never cook because I can't cook. I mean, I can cook, not a full bird. Like I'm not going to sit here and make a full bird. Like if I had to make a Thanksgiving meal, and let's say it's just the four of us, I'm going to my Boston Market. And by the way, Boston Market, if you want to pay us for that, I'll happily eat Boston Market for the rest of my life. So yeah, so I can cook, but outside of like making a full turkey, so you get turkey, you get some stuffing. I gotta have rice and beans, obviously, as part of that, and then you get this pork a dish that I just mentioned, right? With Benny, and then you have sometimes like her father wanted to make a ham. That's more for Christmas time, but that was pretty much the dishes. Like there's no real mac and cheese side. There was cornbread and stuff like that. So you mix a little bit of the Cuban tradition with like the penne and the rice and beans, but then you also add you got your turkey, you got a little bit of yams, and you got a little bit of stuffing and some cornbread. So yeah, that's the way our kind of Thanksgiving goes. So speaking of giving thanks, I do want to get into our first segment, Nick, here, because as this was all breaking, as everybody was kind of leaving for the holidays, you mentioned about that LA traffic, which is wild to see that. Shout out to the folks that were sitting in that. And as the days kind of went on in the holiday break, we started to realize that President Biden, Qatar, excuse me, the nation of Qatar, Egypt, Israel, Hamas, everyone was building these negotiations over a period of 4 days to ultimately get a ceasefire or a pause, whatever you want to call it, to allow over 50 or so hostages, mostly women and children that Hamas had, to be released over the next 4 days. Now, again, this is last week. So this was Friday going into Saturday morning, Sunday, and then coming into where you're listening to this potentially on a Tuesday. So this past Monday. And now there's still talks as both Israel and Hamas are trying to extend this truce, because part of it was, and the original agreement was, look, get some hostages freed back. Israel would also free 33 Palestinians that were held in jails. That was what just happened this past Monday. Under the agreement, Hamas was going to release 10 hostages each day. Like I said, as of that Friday going into Saturday. And so far, Hamas has released 69 total hostages as of this taping, primarily women and children. Israel has agreed to free 150 Palestinians that were held in prisons in Israel, mainly women and minors, many of whom were detained but never charged. So that's a key thing to note there. And also, a lot of aid was allowed to flow into Gaza. So there was more aid trucks that were allowed to come into the country. Israeli officials said Egyptian and Qatari mediators pressed Hamas for 12 hours to change the list of who they would be releasing as part of this. And they finally agreed to that, because Hamas, I guess, has a list of all of these hostages that have been held and what, order or ranking they had classified with them. I want you to take a listen real quick, Nick, and we're going to react on the other side to President Biden talking about how all of these negotiations came to be. If you missed any of this, take a listen to the president.
This has been the product of a lot of hard work and weeks of personal engagement for me and my team. We've been in close contact with the leaders of Qatar, Egypt, and Israel, speaking with each one of them repeatedly over the past few weeks. And we will continue to remain personally engaged to see that this deal is fully implemented and work to extend the deal as well. For weeks, I've been advocating a pause in the fighting for two purposes: to increase the assistance getting into the Gaza civilians who need help, and to facilitate release of hostages. And we know that innocent children in Gaza are suffering greatly as well, because this war that Hamas has unleashed has such consequences. Under this deal, fighting in Gaza has now been paused for 3 days. Over that time, 58 hostages have been released, including the Thai, Filipino, and Russian nationals. Dozens of families have been reunited.
Funny enough, Nick, and I don't want to tease it too much, but as you're going to be taking this holiday break, we're going to have a correspondent that's been covering the war over there in Israel coming on the program from PBS. I'm going to tease that in a coming episode or so. So it'll be in a few episodes, but she's going to be coming on the program. She does a fantastic job. If you watch PBS NewsHour or see any of the work over on newshour.org, you're going to know who this is. So she'll be coming on the program. I'm excited to talk to her because some of her reporting is what we're reading here. And I'm reading some of the stuff as well from Axios, as Barak Ravid has been doing a great job. We've invited him on the program as well. He's a little busy, obviously, with doing all this great reporting. But shout out to the journalists that are covering all this. The president mentioned there's something, Nick, and I want to get kind of your thoughts on this. 14,850 Palestinians have been killed so far as of this taping, according to the Ministry of Health in Gaza. There's always a preface of like, well, Hamas is running Gaza. Do we trust those numbers? The president alluded to that once upon a time. And then when you talk to people that are Palestinian, they'll say, hey, wait a minute. I mean, these are images. These are videos that are being taken by journalists that are there on the ground showcasing what is happening. And he just mentioned there hundreds of innocent civilians, hundreds, thousands now, as according to that number, are dying. And I asked Representative Seth Moulton when he came on a few weeks ago about like, how do you live between these two sentences? Like, I'm giving you weapons to shoot the people, and then when the people die, we're also helping to give them aid. And like, you got to go listen to his answer a couple episodes ago. It just has always stuck with me. It's like, it's so weird that we continue to do this. Like, we're continuing, and I get it. Israel is an ally. We can get into the history of that region, but we're giving them the weaponry because Israel has mentioned, and Barak Ravid and other reporters have mentioned this, that Israel has vowed to continue the war after this pause is over. Even spokespersons that I've seen across the television sphere for the IDF and the Israeli government have all said full military power will be rained upon Hamas until, and this is again, according to the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, he said, we will not stop until we achieve our goal, which is the destruction of Hamas and bringing home all of the hostages from Gaza to Israel. But listen to the first part of that sentence, the destruction of Hamas. And that is after whenever this pause ends. All right, Nick, now let me turn to you, because I said a mouthful there about all of the hostages that have been freed. There are potentially more that are going to be discussed over these next couple of days. As you're listening to this, more may have already been released or been negotiated upon, as you know, they're trying to continue this pause later on into the week. The president mentioned there about some of the Thai nationals. There's some folks that were Russian nationals that were a part of captivity. We're going to get into some crazy stories of some of these hostages. I saw one about, as other networks have been covering all this, one guy was on CNN and his wife and two little girls have been, kidnapped, as you and I both have wife and two little girls, and all three of them will return back to him as part of this hostage release. I forget the name of the family, but it is good to see that kind of stuff. What do you make of all of this, and then what the president kind of said there?
It's incredible to see people return home. All we've hoped for all this time is, some opportunity in a hostage situation that hopefully people are returned to their families. And it's starting to happen. Regardless of where you stand on this conflict, what we can agree on is the hostages have to come home. And it's been great to see it. And for the Biden administration, it's been a huge success to be able to work with Qatar, work with others to ensure that this happens. We've heard a lot of voices that have talked about ceasefires, that have talked about, the munitions that the U.S. offers to Israel, like all kinds of the negativity, and a lot of it is willing. It makes sense to have the conversation, but what we should be focusing on now is that hostages are starting to come home, and that's it. To your point about trying to wrap your head around providing weapons to someone, and then on the other side of it, trying to find peaceful solutions and trying to provide support to those who are being attacked by the very weapons that you provided to the attacker. Right? It is hard, and I've often wondered what it is about human beings that create this kind of rationalization for this. And again, I'm not saying either side is right or wrong on this. People have argued that enough. I've said what I've said about that already. But I've also thought about this idea of a ceasefire, and that as you shared, as soon as the ceasefire period ends, the idea of talking about, well, we're going to go right back at it. And that's just weird to me too. In a ceasefire, you'd think that all of these soldiers would just take a pause and recognize, I've just been shooting, launching drones, launching missiles, all kinds of ungodly stuff. And we've taken a pause from the violence. And somehow we're supposed to get amped up again. It's like playing a sport, and then suddenly they shut off the light, shut off the clock, and then there's a long break, and then everything comes back on again. It's like, all right, resume. How do you do that? How do you and we're talking about in war now. How do you sort of step back into that mentality of, I'm supposed to kill my enemy, I'm supposed to harm my enemy, after having a moment of inevitably reflection and a pause? And that's the strangest thing of the human experience, is the ability to sort of turn the kill switch on. I certainly, for that reason, could never serve, my heart goes out to those who do. But I always come back to this, and as foolish as I sound saying, and I'll keep saying it here, if Netanyahu and Hamas want to fight this out, go in the desert and do it. Honestly, go bring your weapons, whatever you want to do. Why are we subjecting so many damn people to this, that have to fight and have to launch bombs and shoot off guns? And when at the end of the day, this is the Prime Minister of Israel who has a view on this, this is the leaders of Hamas who have a view on this, just line up your people and just get your leadership team out there and do it the old-fashioned way. We don't need to involve all these people, but it'll never happen because Netanyahu's not picking up a weapon. And the leaders of Hamas are probably not the ones out there with the guns. This is just soldiers. These are people's children. These are people's husband or their wives, siblings, for mindless conflict over a contested area that, I mean, we've seen not just since the forming of Israel, even before that, like just folks who cannot refuse to get along and we play this out, what seems to be every few years or every generation where this conflict keeps coming back. And we've had numerous people on the show who've talked about the fact that this feels like an endless conflict. But finally, we're taking a pause, getting people home, and the idea that, well, as soon as we do that, we get right back to stuff. And I understand the idea of continuing to fight until all hostages get back. I understand that. The idea of the destruction of Hamas, that goes back to what I said at the start, is that this seems like a bigger goal for Israel, is that the destruction of Hamas, along with getting the hostages back. And I think you would think that upon the return of the hostages, this matter is resolved and it's stopped. But Israel will not forgive what happened on October 7th, and I'm not blaming them for doing so. But the idea that we will not end this until a political organization is completely destroyed. Mind you, a political organization that's not like sitting in a building somewhere. This is almost like Al-Qaeda. You're going to have to go track these people down. And how do you sort them out from just ordinary citizens who just are tired of living in these just desperate situations? There is no way to do that easily. And as a result, you're going to have more and more people die after a pause in the fighting.
Yeah. And, not only that, you create a vacuum, right? If you were to, let's say, eradicate, and I'm using air quotes in this, and we've seen this in other territories. And we, the last episode we just had with Curve, and we were from This Week Explained, we were discussing that. And this is somebody who has served and has worked alongside our military. So the Palestinian Authority that's in the West Bank, President Biden has talked about leaning into them and what they could do with respect to this. And that's kind of been refuted by a bunch of different people in terms of, that some people have called them Hamas light. Some people, not me. Again, these are other people that are out there on the television docket. So, and again, Israel, again, they will say this until they're blue in the face. And there's video out there of different Hamas leaders and officials saying that their goal is to destroy Israel. So they'll continue to argue that, hey, well, they want to destroy us. We want to destroy them. We keep going round and round in circles. We talked at the beginning of the show about humanity. I did want to spotlight this one story that, Nick, you and I mentioned it when this all started, and I think it was around October 12th, 13th, when you and I were recording. We played a video of this father. I believe his name is Thomas Hand, who was crying to friend of the show, Clarissa Ward, who's an international correspondent over at CNN. She was doing this story on him because he had been told that his daughter, Emily Hand, was killed at the kibbutz in southern Israel on October 7th, excuse me. So apparently his daughter had been staying at a friend's house, and so she was staying over at the friend's house. And then obviously when the raid happens and stuff like that, he was told later by officials that she was killed. Well, long story short, we come to find out when the second wave of hostages happened over the weekend and they were released by Hamas, Emily Hand, this 9-year-old little girl, was a part of that hostage exchange. Now, I believe he knew beforehand that she wasn't killed, maybe like a week or so ago, but still unclear with respect to that. But I want you to take a listen to what he said when he did that interview with Clarissa Ward, when he thought that his daughter had been taken so short in her life from him. And then what he has said now since she's been returned back home. Take a listen.
I know for a fact that she was led away by the Hamas terrorists. There's eyewitness accounts of it.
Before learning that his daughter was alive, Emily's father memorably, painfully told CNN's Clarissa Ward that her death was a better alternative than being held captive by Hamas.
That was the best possibly that I was hoping for. She was either dead or in Gaza. And if you know anything about what they do to people in Gaza, that is worse than death.
He is waiting for a chance to hug his beautiful little girl.
was told that she was found in the kibbutz and she was found dead, but in actual fact, it was a mistake. She wasn't found dead. I was relieved. I was relieved that she was dead and it was all over. It would have been pretty quick. Yeah, it was a relief thinking that she wasn't in Gaza.
I don't even know where to begin there. I will say I remember seeing this story with Tom Hand. Again, been following Clarissa for a while and have messaged with her in the past on some other stuff that she's done reporting wise. And I remember seeing that story and it obviously moved me because his daughter, again, random daughter staying over a friend's house, not thinking anything of it. And then you come to find out that, not only that, the friend's mother, all kidnapped by Hamas. He's told that they were dead. So now he's sitting here with the grief of thinking that his 9-year-old daughter is dead. And then you find out 5 weeks later that this is a mistake. 1, 2, it's her birthday. So now she may still be alive. And then a week later, she comes home and you heard there a little bit in the video of him crying, saying something, I'm assuming in Hebrew there. They are Irish Israeli. I have found out the family. Nick, this kind of resonated obviously with me. We all have little kids. Your kids obviously closer to Emily's age than mine's are. It's an incredible story. It has a happy ending, but I just don't know how I would feel about all of this range of emotions, especially we've talked a little bit about the Israeli government not giving so many answers to the family members of the hostages. We've seen this now as town halls have been done by Lester Holt with the hostages. I mentioned it recently. I've seen others that have gone on other TV appearances. And the biggest thing from them has been the lack of communication. Up until all of this happened, and don't forget, it was 240 people that were originally kidnapped. Only 69 have been freed as of this taping. So that leaves 170 other people, mostly men, that are still out there. Hostage families still don't know the status of where their child is. I think of one family that has a 22-year-old son. And the reason I'm thinking of him is because he's wearing a Knick jersey. And obviously everybody knows I'm a Knick fan. And, the family's at a game, just in the preseason. And then they went to Israel on a trip. And all of a sudden this happens at the kibbutz that they were staying at. So visiting family. So it's this range of emotions. It's the thinking that your daughter is dead. It's the government gave me the wrong info. Now I know that she's actually in Gaza in these tunnels. Like I was just swept up in it. And I saw this story. I was telling my wife, I'm like, do you remember this story? And I was so fixated on it because the way he was explaining to Clarissa Ward the things that happen in Gaza and what he perceives, or maybe he thinks or knows about the way they treat prisoners and hostages. He just didn't want his daughter to be subjugated to that. And here he finds out 5 weeks later, she's alive. And a week after that, she's released. What do you make of this incredible story, man, and the way it played out and the twists and turns that I mentioned there?
I wouldn't know what to say. You go through this process of grief knowing that your child is gone. And there's a point, I imagine, where you've resolved that your family's -1. So then fast forward 5 weeks later and you find out that that's actually not true. Of course you're happy, but I can't even imagine the mind bleep that happens. And who do you get angry with? Who do you blame? While all at the same time, immense gratitude. It's to say emotional roller coaster really doesn't do this justice, but I can't think of any other way to explain it. Is this like just rising tide and falling as well of what a parent goes through. And yeah, obviously, as you and I are parents, it's the nightmare. In this country, we worry constantly about our kids in schools, because we can't seem to get that one right. But in other parts of the country, you have situations like this, other parts of the world, and you just live in fear. But that's not, you pray that that's the situation you'll never be in, and to be in it, and then to find out that you're actually not, and that your kid comes home. There's not enough blessings that you can offer to God or to anyone. I'm extremely happy for the family, but I don't know, man. Like for a government to share information on, who has been killed, who's not been, who's been taken as hostage, it must be impossible. I mean, neither side trusts each other. So the names of people being collected that have been taken by Hamas, like why would I trust any level of transparency from them to share names? And only now, or as hostages are being given back, is this happening? I would wonder, is there another Hand family that's going to happen, that's going to come across something like this? That may well be the case. And it also just says too that there is so little trust, so little transparency in this, that this is just barbarism. It's just two sides that cannot stand one another and engage in warfare, and in the midst of something that is, international law. You're supposed to honor this. They don't. There's no reason to trust either side. And, for that father to consider what could have been, like what he assumes would happen to his daughter in that place, and to almost prefer that she die because it's quick and it's done and the pain is gone. And then to find out that she survived. There's going to be a mountain of questions you're going to want to find out from her. How's she doing? Is she healthy? Is she safe? Did anything happen to her while she was, kept as a hostage? It's weird. I mean, there's obviously gratitude I think we all feel for this great story, but at the same time, you're also horrified by the just absurdity of what these people do to each other, that anyone does to each other in time of war.
Yeah. No, well said. It is true. Like as we're thinking about hostages being returned and this heartwarming story of it all, we forgot they were taken in the first place, and the brutality that occurred on October 7th. So you're right. It's such a weird balance, man. So we're going to be following all of this with respect to the hostage release. If there's more coming down the pike, as Israel and Hamas are continuing to extend this truce, as more aid enters Gaza. Like I mentioned, we're going to be having a correspondent from one of the networks coming on that's actually been to the region. Actually, also potentially having somebody coming on that has not negotiated so much hostage crises and things like that, but has worked at the State Department and has dealt with situations like this, trying to get American prisoners back that have been wrongly imprisoned and stuff like that. So stay tuned for more on that in the coming weeks from us. When we come back after the break, she's the author of the book, Democracy in Darkness. Katlyn Carter joins us to break down this great book, out now, available wherever books are sold. Katlyn, when we come back after the break. This episode is presented by our friends over at BetterHelp, a new partnership that we're doing here at the show. I had been alluding to this a while ago because I can see it playing out everywhere. It's the end of the year. Events are playing out not only here in the U.S., but internationally. And people are anxious, they're overwhelmed, and we need to talk. I mean, it's the purpose of this show, right? Can we please talk? And we've partnered with our friends over at BetterHelp. If you're thinking of starting therapy, I want you all to give BetterHelp a try because it's online, it's convenient, it's flexible, it's suitable to your schedule. Nick, I know you're excited about this partnership, and we've been talking a lot about the mental health space and getting people to talk again, right? Give us a little bit of your thoughts on this partnership with BetterHelp.
Back in 2020, during the pandemic, we saw the benefits of going virtual. And one of the biggest examples of that was the work that the folks at BetterHelp were doing. about making mental health available in the virtual space. But oftentimes when we think about BetterHelp, we think about post-pandemic. And the reality is that BetterHelp has been around since 2013 to help provide access to healthcare. And they have about 30,000 licensed therapists that they're working with to offer that opportunity. I'm very excited about this partnership.
Yeah, that's very well said. So all you got to do is go to betterhelp.com/canwepleasetalk. You're going to get 10% off your first month. You're going to fill out a brief questionnaire while you're there so you can get matched up with a licensed therapist. You can switch therapists as well anytime for no additional charge. You know, I want people to start talking again. That's why we've done this partnership with our friends over at BetterHelp. Hit the link in our show notes or go to betterhelp.com/canwepleasetalk to get started today. This episode is presented by our friends, our good friends, over at Fresh Roasted Coffee. The coffee that's keeping me awake when Nick Savari's putting me to sleep with one of his trains of thought. You give me a look here, Nick. Give me a little bit of how Fresh Roasted Coffee keeps you awake when I'm boring you with some of my trains of thought.
Okay, thank you. Interesting introduction. Folks, I'm a huge fan, as you all know, of Fresh Roasted Coffee, primarily for the simple fact about diversity. If you're a tea person, they've got you covered. If you're a coffee person, they got you covered too. Mike and I take our coffee very differently. Mike is a Keurig man. That is efficient. That is tasty. That's the way to go. I am a French press person. Nowadays, I actually grind my own beans. So when I get my batch of fresh roasted coffee, it goes right into the grinder, then to the French press, boiled water, let's go. But in either case, our cup of coffee comes out delicious. Mostly because they ask you at the jump, just tell us about you. Simple quiz. They'll direct you to the bean or brand that you should be getting in touch with. And that's the way to go. And then they just produce an incredible cup of coffee, again, regardless of how you do it.
No, that's exactly right. You can take the quiz over at freshroastedcoffee.com. And in the show notes page right now of this episode, hit the link for a discount or enter in the promo code after you've taken the quiz, after you've selected the coffee you're going to order. Enter in the promo code, can we please get 20 for 20% off your first purchase. I'm telling you, this coffee is delicious. Go to freshroastedcoffee.com today. All right, kind enough to join us here on the podcast. She's the author of a great book that's out now, Democracy in Darkness. She's also a professor over at Notre Dame, and that's Katlyn Carter. Katlyn, Mike Leon, Nick Savari, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
You know, I was reading this book last night as my wife was reading her book. We like reading books at night. She's on the iPad. I'm on the actual physical copy. And I had a bunch of different questions lined up for you. But first, for our audience, maybe it's not familiar with the book, or they're at a Barnes & Noble right now and they see this on the shelves. Tell our audience a little bit about this book and what made you want to write it.
Well, I worked in Washington, D.C. for a couple years before I went to graduate school, and I was doing media relations. And I got really interested in the relationship between public opinion and our elected officials. So I was particularly interested in the role of the media in facilitating that relationship. So when I went to graduate school to study history, I thought, I'm going to go back to the origin. I'm going to go back to the 18th century and look at how people at the time thought about these questions when they were setting up our government. So the book really tries to understand the origins of modern representative democracy by looking at how people thought about what should be done openly, transparently, and what could be done in secret. And I just found that debates about that really spoke to the core of how representative democracy came to function in the US and also in France.
Katlyn, in your book, you talk about the role of the perception of transparency. As you just mentioned, the formation of the governments in the US and France. Looking at this now in 2023, how do we still experience because your book also mentions that the reactions from both citizenry was a little different by the way transparency and secrecy played out. Mm-hmm. When we look at those two nations, in the current time, has that played any role in the influence? I ask this partly because I think of even the reaction that the French will sometimes have to like a labor dispute, like people run to the streets and are much more active. Whereas in the US, We're seeing an uptick in that. And in labor as well. But oftentimes our reaction can sometimes be more muted in deference to our political officials as opposed in France.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I mean, the book really traces a different attitude, as you note at the beginning, toward questions of transparency and secrecy in government. So, in France, from the beginning of their revolution in 1789, there's this real commitment to transparency, absolute transparency, as much as they can do it. So, keeping open doors to all their legislative meetings and meetings where they're writing their constitution, for example. And there's this real kind of expectation that there's going to be open doors and that those records are all going to be published. And they, for the most part, revolutionaries really commit to that. In the United States, it's not so much that. There's absolutely those who do have that expectation. But there's also another facet in the United States. There's also a kind of a group that says, wait a minute, there's some utility for meeting behind closed doors sometimes, and kind of deploying secrecy, especially in the deliberative process. So in the US, there's much more of a willingness to embrace that and kind of use those tactics in politics early on, and then it kind of gets a little bit more transparent going forward into the 19th century. Whereas France kind of goes the other way and kind of tries to shut things down a little bit as it goes forward into the 19th century. But yeah, I think we see the legacies of that today. I mean, I argue in the book that the importance of the use of that kind of secrecy at the founding moment, had lasting implications for how we think about representative government and the way in which we think it becomes legitimate. So, we tend to have a higher tolerance for our elected officials, going to today Washington and saying, okay, we elected them to go and make the best decisions. And there's some, a degree of kind of trust in that. And in France, I mean, there's more of a legacy of we want our elected officials to do exactly what we tell them to do and want them to do. So I think that, yeah, you can see some legacies of that down to the present day.
There's a bunch in the book that we're going to get to. We're going to get into some secrecy that you just mentioned there. I love that I did not know this before you came on about that you had worked in DC and some of the overlap between you and I. So I'm going to ask you a little bit about that. But first thing, it's something I noticed in the book yesterday. And it was funny because we were teasing the interview in recent episodes. And I had said accidentally, democracy dies in darkness. And then it's because of the WAPO masthead. And then I realized you actually mentioned it in the book about democracy dies in darkness is darkness, is the masthead of the Washington Post. But it was founded in the secrecy of darkness. I'm paraphrasing what you said. How does your book get at reconciling that? Because you mentioned it in the beginning of the book. You're like, I'm going to take you through. So without giving it all away for everybody, tell us a little bit about that dichotomy between those two sentences.
Yeah, so the book traces the origins of that kind of claim that we can find on top of the Washington Post today, that democracy dies in darkness. That's kind of the conviction that came about in the Age of Revolutions itself back in the 18th century. So the book kind of shows how transparency really came to be considered very central to democracy in the modern era. But at the same time, the book starts with this question of, well, how do we explain that at the same time our Constitution in the United States was written behind closed doors under oath of secrecy? And so the book tries to point out that despite our commitment to transparency and how much that's used in rhetoric about politics and especially about democracy, in fact, our founding moment and many other important moments in our politics actually do occur in secrecy or use secrecy throughout the deliberative process. So the book just kind of points out that there is that disagreement sometimes between what's happening in practice and in action versus what people are talking about rhetorically as being really central to democracy.
Katlyn, on that subject of secrecy, I wanted to get your thoughts about voting, at the legislative level, because often right now our politicians, even the most ignorant of those, will proudly talk about the way they voted. And it sometimes often seems as though there are politicians who could be swayed to possibly cross party lines, but there's the pressure of constituents, there's the pressure of the media that if it's found that a person votes a certain way, that it would go against them in an upcoming election. Where's your stance on the possibility of what I would consider essentially a blind election where no one outside of the legislative body knows who voted on what? Could that possibly be a corrective for what we're seeing now in terms of political infighting and tribalism?
Yeah, I came into this project thinking that transparency is always the best policy. And I sort of came in with that kind of bias. I think that is our just contemporary bias when thinking about these issues. But as I worked through the project, I started to think about it a little differently. And I started to think maybe that's not always true, and that there might, in fact, be a role for some level of secrecy in promoting better policy decisions or promoting compromise or changing of, minds or opinions. And I think that you're right. I mean, we've seen that come up sometimes recently. I think I think it was in the first Trump impeachment hearing, you did have some officials, I remember, kind of saying, well, if this vote happened, if this was a secret vote, in the Senate, that actually he might be convicted, right? Versus if it's a public vote, it'll never happen. And I think that, you sometimes see that come up, but there's a real reticence to ever do that. And I don't know. I don't know that I would say that it's necessarily something we should do, because it's all case dependent, right? And if you start allowing all votes to happen in secret, then, I think that can also lead down some dangerous roads where policymakers become really divorced from public opinion or their constituents, far more than we would want them to be.
Professor Carter, you just mentioned the former president. If you say his name 3 times like Beetlejuice, he may appear. So I did want to get into that because it's so funny. Because here is somebody, and you wrote about this in the book, about the thin line between, democracy and autocracy. And the former president recently made some statements on an interview with Univision down here in my neck of the woods in Miami, talking about some of the things that he would do as president in terms of, either prosecuting political opponents or at least going after it from the investigation standpoint. Mm-hmm. That doesn't feel democratic. What do you make of the current state of politics in America, where there is somebody running on a platform like that kind of fails in the face of what democracy is supposed to sound and look like? And is there any parallels in your book? We have a bunch of authors over my shoulder here that have drawn on historical parallels between media coverage in the 70s of figures like this to now. Is there anything in the book that you, as you were writing this and looking back, anything that there was like a Trump-like figure that did some of this stuff that you kind of relayed, or at least in your research learned a little bit more about?
Yeah, I don't think I can point to any specific person where I would say this is a parallel to Donald Trump. He, in many ways, I think he is new and unique, which is not to say that everything about him or his presidency or campaign is, unprecedented. But I think that you point to something important, which is that over the last several years, our democracy has felt like it's especially fragile. And we're seeing a lot of norms broken. We're seeing a lot of kind of forays into behavior, rhetoric that we would think of as more authoritarian. So, one thing that I would think of in terms of historical parallel, or something that jumped out to me when I was writing the book, is that in the 18th century, a lot of these people I'm writing about really thought, transparency is it's the cure. It's the cure for demagogues. That's the way that demagogues will be brought down. If we just have more publicity, more transparency, they can't really stand up to scrutiny like that. And I think that Donald Trump, living through recent years, kind of poses a challenge to that line of thinking, because, the more transparency, the more publicity, media coverage of, him and things that he says, you're starting to see a lot of people question, if that is a good thing, that's the role of journalists, to provide that kind of scrutiny, or if it is, potentially having a negative effect and providing him a lot of attention and kind of the fuel to continue, being a presence in politics when otherwise he might not. So the book actually does speak to that. I think some of the unforeseen consequences or complications of transparency and the potential for that to turn into something that's a bit more performance or spectacle in politics. And I do think those of us who, have been following things for the last decade probably have found ourselves thinking about that a fair amount, the role of spectacle in politics.
To that end, about your awareness of American politics, you're an educator. Right now, most recently, actually, we had a musician that was complaining about spending in New York City, budget shortfalls, and then placing that at the feet of the president. When you have college students in your classroom, what do you find to be the biggest some of the biggest blind spots that students have? And then if you could be able to talk to high school teachers, middle school social studies teachers, what do you wish would happen more in more of the K-12 setting about better either preparing students or making sure students are a little bit more civically or in general aware of how our government actually works by the time they get to your classroom?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that is something that's really important and we definitely need more of. So, right now I'm teaching a class on the Constitution, the history of the Constitution. And, always coming in, I ask how many of you have ever read the Constitution? And often not many of them have. And that really mirrors, the broader American public. So I think it would be great if we had more of a focus on, actually reading things like our Constitution, knowing how the branches of government work, and really, learning and teaching American history. I think it's really vital if we want to prepare kids to become responsible adults and participants in our society, that they need to have that grounding. And they also need to know how to think for themselves. I mean, that's something else I notice, especially now, is that, if you ask students where they get their news or how they get their information, it is really atomized. And often they're going to social media, and that's kind of how they're consuming information. So I do think we also need to think just about information literacy and thinking about, how do we, ensure that we're sending people out there who are equipped to take in the fire hose of, media and information coming at them, and actually, discern true from false, and make their way through that so that they can, have informed opinions and participate.
Katlyn, Mike a moment ago talked about the former president of the United States. I want
Mhm.
to ask about the incoming president of Argentina. I'm going to take a different sway.
Okay.
But the most recent election, you had Javier Milei, who is a Trump disciple, very similar, former TV person, economist, completely goes off script, talks about getting rid of government institutions, and transparency is very much a part of his platform. I bring this up because A, he just won, but B, it seems like there is this idea that the more transparent government is the way to go. And as a historian, as a professor, has that model ever worked? It seems that, I mean, in your research, it seems like the answer is you came in with the eyes of maybe you could and not so much. But in your learning, has it ever been the case, or are we being dangerously naive when a government or a government leader promises you essentially to have glass houses in their government buildings, entirely glass houses?
Sure. I mean, in all of human history, I don't know, I can't speak to all of human history, but I can speak to the, examples that I know well, which is the 18th century, the founding of kind of modern representative democracy. And yeah, I mean, what I found is that if in France, for example, where they really were dedicated to a high level of transparency, that was done to try to foster trust between the public and their elected officials at a moment when they're trying to establish a representative democracy for the first time. Um, but it had a paradoxical effect of actually sometimes undermining trust in the government, because when people could see, everything their elected officials did, everything they said, those who were following closely often, kind of raised their voices and said, "Wait a minute, I don't actually really agree with what you're saying in there. I don't actually agree with what you're doing." And then that led to a sense that, well, how representative is this government if it doesn't seem to be aligning with expressed public opinion? Now, that's a little tricky because in the 18th century, ascertaining what public opinion actually was at any point was even harder than today. That's before public opinion polling and things like that we do have today. So, some of those challenges are maybe a little better, but in the end, I think that did teach us a lesson that we have to keep in mind, that sometimes, transparency can be, number one, more for show than it really is in substance. So, it also could be used to say, if you're going to make everything transparent, then it makes it harder for people to take that in, right? It actually could be a mechanism to hide different things just by inundating people with so much, to watch or see, that they can't really make sense of it. So that's one challenge. But another challenge, I think, that we might think about how doing that can sometimes empower the loudest or most proximate kind of voices of public opinion to government in a way that, they're not as empowered if they're not able to seize on every detail and, piece of the process. in politics. And when they are able to do that, it can sometimes have a counterintuitive effect of kind of undermining trust in the government, actually. So I think that's what my research and the precedent kind of shows on that.
Katlyn, before we let you go, we love to ask authors that come on the show this. So somebody's right now at a local bookstore, or they're at a national chain. They happen to see the book. Oh, Democracy in Darkness, Secrecy, Transparency in the Age of... Give the elevator pitch if you were standing over their shoulder and being like, hey, that's my book. Let me tell you a little bit about it. Give them the elevator pitch as to why they should purchase this book.
Yeah, I would say, do you want to try to understand better how our democracy came to look the way that it does and function the way that it does? This book might be for you. It uses debates over what should be transparent and what could be secret in government to try to understand how people thought about democracy as a form of government and how it should work. And these are questions that we are still grappling with today. So if you're trying to come up with your answer to that and what you think about these questions, I think the book might be really interesting to you in providing some historical context.
That's the understatement of the year about what's happening with democracy right now. I can't thank you enough, Katlyn, for coming on the podcast. Like I mentioned, Democracy in Darkness, you can go get the book wherever books are sold. Continued success to you. Your students at Notre Dame are lucky to have you. Please be safe.
Thank you so much. It was great talking with you.
This episode is presented by the good folks over at Better Sleep, a personalized sleep experience for more restful nights and wakeful days. Nick, how's your sleeping habits, buddy? I know you got 2 kids. You wake up early. You go to sleep late, probably. Take me through. Are you sleeping better? Do you need help getting to sleep? What's your big issue and hang up here as you're trying to fall asleep at night?
High quality sleep. I tend to go to sleep late. I love to read, but inevitably I do have to get up early. So I'm averaging probably maybe like 5 hours of what I would consider like quality sleep. So yeah, I was excited you mentioned this partnership because one of the things about Better Sleep that's awesome is the fact that the entire sleep experience is what they focus on. Everything from sounds to help you sleep, better understanding your sleep patterns. And Mike, that's really the breakdown that they offer. Super easy app to use. I can't brag enough about it. I'm starting to use it myself just to really just better understand how I sleep and how I can improve that. Because we take it for granted, but almost any athlete will tell you, any professional will tell you, our understanding of sleep is coming to the forefront of what really helps to improve performance. So I'm all for it.
No, you're right. Anybody will tell you need your 8 hours at least. Improve your well-being in just 1 week. If you go to the link right now in our show notes, it's going to take you over to Better Sleep, and you can take the quiz. They have a take the quiz button that's available right there as soon as you come into the app. So that way it can adjust the sounds and everything you need to get a better quality sleep. Click the link in our show notes right now and head to bettersleep.com for a restful night's sleep. All right, our thank yous to Katlyn Carter there. That is our show. Go get her book, available wherever books are sold. If you want to watch the video portion of our interview with Katlyn, head over to our YouTube channel, type in Can We Please Talk Podcast. We should pop right up. Audio podcast platforms, by now, Apple, Spotify, Google. Shout out to everybody listening to us on Good Pods, YouTube Music. Shout out to Acast, our hosting platform. You can't do without them. Can't do without each and every one of you that listens to this program. As always, I'm Mike Leon.
And I'm Nick Saveri.
We'll see everybody next time.